In this video we have a little bit of Fieldcraft, and that is for timed rocket attacks. This is pretty common in modern guerrilla warfare. I'm going to cover a couple different ways this can be done. But primarily when you're looking at modern warfare examples of this, you're talking about rockets between 107 millimeter up to 122 millimeter. These are com block manufactured and supplied rockets. Easiest to get a hold of on the market. Obviously, you know, if they get a hold of smaller ones, they use those. They get a hold of larger ones, they use those. They use what's available. On this type of operation, a guerrilla comes in to a pre-sighted location near their target, which is typically going to be larger, like a fire base or a forward operating base, or some type of supply facility or harbor facility or airfield. The guerrilla already has the spot picked out and marked out on the ground with, you know, a small pile of rocks, a stake, whatever. They've already determined the exact location the launcher is going to go at. They come in, they set up at night, get the launcher set up, get it set to the correct azimuth so it's pointing the correct direction for their target. They set the elevation, the angle on for the launcher, for the tube, set up their firing circuit, do their circuit tests, connect it to the rocket, do a final circuit check, and set their timer, and they walk off. And then whatever amount of time later, that timer hits the end and it allows the current to flow through to the rocket fires. Now, I've seen, you can look this stuff up, there's lots of different homemade launchers out there that have been used. It's not just mounted on the backs of trucks and that. You can make single-use launchers and use them. There's pictures of them from Vietnam, basically lengths of bamboo cut in half, cleared out in the center to make that channel that the rocket gets set on. I've also seen them using just sheet metal that was turned into roughly a 90-degree angle to create a launch cradle that the rocket was set on, launched off of that. I've seen pictures of eaves off of houses, the old style metal ones being used. Iraq and Afghanistan, you'll find that they'll use pipes, whatever type of pipe they can get a hold of. Or potentially it could be a disposable launcher of some type. If you got the small enough rockets, or make them, you could launch them out of an old law rocket tube. You could launch them out of an old expended AT-4 launcher or equivalent from around the world. All the launcher does is it keeps the rocket aimed in the correct direction as the motor ignites. Now up here you see the basic setup on how it's basically done. You have just the battery, the timer, which is typically put on the positive lead, and then the two leads are hooked in on the launcher. Depending on the type of rocket determines where those leads are connected. Because on some of the rockets, the negative gets, or the ground gets connected to the launcher itself, and then the positive just gets hooked into the wire coming off the back of the rocket. It depends on the particular type. One picture I've seen from Afghanistan, someone made a launcher out of an old Vickers water-cooled machine gun tripod. They had it set up on top of the hill overlooking Bagram Air Base. They had the rocket set on the cradle for the machine gun. They had set up a piece of pipe on there just to be the little launch rail. They adjusted the elevation using the existing adjustments on the tripod. And then they used a timer and a motorcycle battery to fire off this 107 millimeter. And typically what happens when the rockets get fired off, they get picked up on counter battery radar, finds the location where the rocket was launched from. Firing coordinates are sent to either defending mortars, rockets, or artillery on the base or a nearby base. And then the area where the rocket was launched from gets pounded. So a way they learned in Vietnam on how to counter this, and this is a tactic that they've worked on since then in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. They put the timers on there so that the guerrilla that set it up, the insurgent that set it up, is not in the area when that rocket fires. So when the counter battery fire comes in, it's landed on nothing but a launcher that was meant for one-time use. Now these launchers, if you're just firing a single rocket, you basically just put the launcher on the ground, maybe put a couple rocks on the legs just to keep it from tipping over while you're gone, and you leave it. If you're using multiple tubes hooked up on your little homemade launcher, you're going to want to secure it in place. So you would use piles of rocks or sandbags, whatever's available. Potentially you could use stakes. I've seen that on some of the manufactured ones where they had landing legs that would come off of the launcher, go down to the ground, and they would pound stakes through the foot of the legs to keep the launcher in place. And then everything gets tightened up real good on the pedestal for the launcher, that pintle that's right below the launcher, right above the legs, so it stays in position. But if you're doing this real ghetto style, you got a homemade launcher that you're using, say you got it set up on a axle from a trailer or something like that, just a couple wheels, the tubes welded on top and that, and you want to keep it from moving. There's a way to keep it on position that the Germans figured out in World War II. Now a lot of people, when they see rocket launchers, you'll see them go off one right next to the other as they're going down. Well, the Germans, they practiced on just getting the rocket launcher brought in, dropping it in place, hooking everything up, and then firing it right away. They didn't go through and secure their launchers. So what they would do is they would alternate the tubes that would fire. So if you're doing a stack on top of each other like this, let's say this is the first one gets fired. Well, this should be the next one that gets fired, your second one. Then your third, your fourth, your fifth, your sixth. So that way you're trying to keep it pointing in the correct direction. If you fire them off sequentially going across from each other and you don't secure the launcher good, you're going to have a drift. So let's say this is our number one that fires. Well, it's over here on the side. When it fires, it's going to kink the launcher a little bit. And then number two fires, it's going to kink it a little bit again. And number three fires, it's going to kink it a little bit again. Now at the launch site, it may not look like much. It may be only an inch or two or a degree or two. But downrange, farther out, that shift could equals over into possibly hundreds of meters of shift. So instead of dropping all your rockets right on the enemy base, your last few rockets might be dropping onto a town full of neutral civilians that the enemy put that base in, which is going to turn the civilian population against you. Make sure to do your continuity checks before you hook up your rockets. So go through, make sure there's no bleed through from your battery through your timer. You're going through checking your continuity. If everything's good, the timer is not allowing any current to seep through, Then hook it up to your rocket, do another continuity check, make sure everything's good to go. Checking your firing circuits and all that. And set your timer and off you go. Now, you're probably saying, well, what if a Guerilla can't get a hold of Chinese-made 107 millimeters or Russian or East European 122 millimeters? Look back in history. This is based on older technology. So your black powder era. The initial ones, at least in the United States, that were used in pretty good numbers were Congreve rockets. These were the ones that had the big wooden pole sticking off the back of it. That pole was put down into a launch tube to hold it in place, but that pole also acted to keep the rocket from, or keep it generally flying in a direction you wanted it to, but it wasn't always perfect. Because of black powder being very variable, especially the way it was packed in there, it won't necessarily burn evenly as it's going through, so that rocket would shift back and forth. It would bounce in that stuff, and as it's doing it, it's throwing it farther and farther off course. Well, they came out with an improvement on that called a hail rocket, where they put venturi on the back, little vanes on the back that would cause the rocket to spin, just like a bullet coming out the barrel of a weapon. That rocket spins, it keeps its trajectory better. It doesn't need that stick on the back, so it keeps its weight more even as it's going down range. The hail rockets typically had a farther range and were more accurate than the Congreves. They might be a little bit more complicated for a Guerilla depending on the materials and tools they have available to them, but if you got to make your own rockets, I think that would be what to look for. Try to find information on the old hail rockets. Now, rocket attacks are typically not going to wipe out a base. You're not going to be able to set up and fire enough rockets onto the base to wipe it out, because you got to take into account the enemy's going to be monitoring the area. They're going to be monitoring to keep you from setting these rockets up. So if you're coming in there and you're trying to set up, say, 500 batteries of multiple rockets so you can just pound the hell out of the base, the enemy's going to see you doing it and they're going to take you out. This is really a harassment thing. Or if you're good enough at it, you have good enough intel, you got the rockets plotted out just right, maybe you can launch these rockets right into, say, an ammunition dump on a base. That was something that I read about in Vietnam, where the Viet Cong and that stuff, if they were going to launch, they only had a few rockets to launch against the base. They'd try to target the ammo dump to try to get the ammunition to go off, because that would cause even more damage to a base. Try to maximize their capabilities. It's a basic, simple tactic. Check into it. For those of you wondering on how this was done in Vietnam, I gave you some info on that. It's pretty basic, pretty straightforward. The only hard part on it is the math, figuring out the angle you need for the rocket, which is going to be based off its burn rate, its shifting weight, and all that stuff. I'm not in field artillery. I didn't plot for field artillery, so I don't have the specifics on this stuff. But you can find out basic stuff on this out there. So if you can't get a hold of rocket motors and that stuff, you're trying to practice making rockets, you know, go the old-fashioned route, go to black powder rockets. And on those, instead of using electric ignition, you just use some type of time fuse. That's all they did to set those off. They just put that time fuse in the back of the fuel for the rocket. It's a compacted black powder. They shoved the fuse in the back, they lit it, and they moved out of the way. The fuse burned down, set off the powder. The energy that's being expelled by the burning black powder went out the back, out the Venturis, and it sent the rocket downrange. So, basic, very basic, and very, very common in guerrilla warfare. Now, for all my engineer brothers in the Patriot and militia movements, always remember, essayons.